Welcome to Osmosis Training. We are going to get into the interface overview in this third video of 3D Studio Max tutorials. We're going to cover main toolbars, axis constraint toolbars, layer toolbars, and just a lot of the basic toolbars up at the top. Some of these toolbars you can turn on and off just by finding a empty spot and usually select like a ridge here at the beginning of this toolbar. I'll right click on that area and you'll get all your other toolbar options. You've got reactor toolbars, toolbars for render shortcuts, snaps, animation layer toolbars. But today we're going to go over just these ones I have checked. Alright, so the first button here on the far left is your undo and redo. Everybody should be kind of familiar with that if you've dealt with other software. It's the same keyboard shortcut as Control Z is undo, Control Y is your redo. You also have the option to right click on your undo button and you get a history of everything that you've done in this file, and you get the option of going back in time and selecting a point in time to go back to undo to. Same goes for the redo. You can redo forward. So those are just right clicks on those buttons. The next three buttons has to do with hierarchies and link constraints between objects. The first two is a link and unlink. So for example, if I have a box and a sphere and I want the sphere to follow the box wherever the box goes, then I would choose select and link, click on my sphere, click and drag over to the box until I get my little link tool, release on the box. And now whenever I move this box, the sphere follows it. It's only a one-way link, so whenever I move the sphere, the box does not move. But if I move the box, the sphere moves. So essentially the box is the parent object of the sphere, and the sphere is the child object of the box in a hierarchy. That third button is a bind to space warp button, which binds objects in your viewport to, for example, wind, gravity, those types of things that will simulate real world physics. This next little drop down list here is selection filters. This gives you a filter for whatever you want to select in the viewport. So for example, if you only want to select geometry, or you only want to be able to select geometry in the viewport, you would select geometry from the list. If you only want to be able to select lights, then you can only select lights. So this kind of helps you if you have large scenes that you have a lot of stuff in your scene and you only want to make a selection of one type of object, then you can select that type of object from this list. You also get the option of making combination selections. So you can go in and open up this filter combinations dialog box and load in combinations of objects. If you wanted to select shapes and lights, then you could choose the two, add, and then you've got a shapes and lights combination. Select by or select object. Of course, this is just your selection tool in Max. It doesn't move, it doesn't do anything but select. Select by name opens a little dialog box and lets you select any object in the scene from a list here in this select from scene dialog box. It also has its own set of filters. You can filter out helpers, lights, shapes, whatever. If you only want to see one type of object in this list, then you can filter those here. Again, this is for if you're working on a large scene with a lot of objects in it. It makes it a lot easier to be able to select just what you want to select without having to dig and find and accidentally selecting other objects. You can also invoke this dialog box by clicking H on your keyboard. So that's the keyboard shortcut for select from scene. This next button is your selection type drop down. So if you hold that button down, you get a little fly out and you get more selections here. You have a rectangular selection, which of course lets you make a rectangular selection. Then your spherical or circular selection, polygonal selection, lets you draw around a certain selection, and lasso, and then you get a spray paint selection or paint selection, which gives you a little spray brush or airbrush tool and lets you paint whatever you want to select, or use this paint tool for selecting. This is also helpful if you're into sub-objects or working on a sub-object of an object. For example, all these points here on this sphere, if I wanted to select only a certain number of points, then I can go in and paint those selections. Alright, the next three buttons is your three transforms in 3D Studio Max: move, rotate, scale. We're going to cover these three transforms in lesson 5 or video 5. So click over to video 5 whenever you get ready to learn about the three transforms of Max, and we'll go over those. This next drop down list is your reference coordinate system. This deals with how Max looks at objects in the viewport and in relation to where their pivot points are, and how you select those objects. Let me change my selection back to rectangular selection here. Oh, missed a button here. This is window crossing button. This button is a toggle button, and it lets you toggle between whether you want to select objects by a crossing window or crossing selection, which will whatever you touch with this crossing selection will get selected. So it doesn't have to be inside the selection, just has to touch the object. And then the other toggle option is window selection, so it does have to be inside the window in order to be selected. So if that object is completely within that selection window, it gets selected. So it doesn't matter if it touches, it has to be inside. Alright. This reference coordinate system drop down list deal with the pivot point and selection pivot point of objects. Max is set to view by default using a view reference coordinate system, so it's dependent on what view you're in. And what I mean by reference coordinate system, of course, is the XYZ axis. So depending on what view I am, the axis, the XYZ axis, changes. As you can see here, if I go to a top view, Y is always going to be pointing to the up, X to the side, so on and so forth. See, Y changes to up, X changes to the side. So it's dependent on your view. In screen, as you can see in the perspective viewport, when I change this to screen, the XYZ always changes in real time depending on my view or screen view of the objects. Z is always going to be coming toward me. X out to the side, Y up. World does not change. Z is always up, Y out to the side, and X to the front. So it doesn't matter where I'm at, what viewport, how I have the objects oriented, this XYZ coordinate system is going to be constant. Parent, as you can see, since I've linked these objects together, since the box is the parent of the sphere, now I'm using the XYZ axis coordinate system of my parent. Local, whenever you create an object, it is created with a local XYZ coordinate already embedded into the object. So if I get this object rotated a certain way, you can see the XYZ axis coordinate system stays stuck to the object's creation or creation parameters. Gimbal, grid, and working is things we'll go into further when we get into the animation portion. And pick lets you actually pick another object to use as the reference coordinate system. So for example, if I wanted to use this large box as my reference coordinate system point, I could go pick the box, and now whenever I use this next drop down list here, which I'm going to go over here shortly, and use that bottom selection, which is the use transform coordinate center, now it doesn't matter what I select, it's always going to use the coordinate center of the object that I picked. And you can see it's here in this list now, box 02. Alright, this next flyout button here has to do with how Max deals with the selection or the pivot point of a selection. The first one is use pivot point center. Of course, it's whatever I select on. If I have multiple objects selected, then it's going to find the center of that selection and use that as my pivot point or my center of my coordinate system. If I use the next one, which is use pivot point center, now it's going to use the pivot point center of each individual object. So for example, if I want to rotate and I'm using pivot point center, they all rotate individually. Of course, my box and my sphere are linked together, so they're going to rotate together. And then the last one is the the use transform coordinate center, which is what I covered just a few minutes ago by using this box as my coordinate center. Now, this next button, select and manipulate, this gives you an added extra tool here for manipulating the parameters of an object in the viewport. So for example, on this sphere, if I go to the Modify tab, I have the radius spinner button here that I can adjust the radius of that sphere. But as long as I've got Select and Manipulate turned on, I can actually change that in the viewport in real time by using this Select tool to grab the radius point on that sphere. Only certain objects in Max will allow you to manipulate them this way. The box doesn't have any parameters that way, but for example a cylinder, it does, just the radius. So there's a couple of other objects out there that let you manipulate them in this way as long as you have the Select and Manipulate button turned on. And it has other applications as well, and when you're dealing with animation and characters, and so it comes in handy. Alright, the next button is keyboard shortcut override toggle. Now this button turns on and off the keyboard shortcuts for Macs. Sometimes the keyboard shortcuts for other software or Windows in general may overlap the keyboard shortcuts for Macs. So if you are having problems with not getting a keyboard shortcut to work in Windows or in Macs, you can toggle them on and off here in Macs by using this keyboard shortcut override toggle. Snaps, these are the next 4 buttons deal with snaps. Your snaps toggle has a little flyout, allows you to snap in 3 dimensions, 2.5 dimensions, or just 2 dimensions. So 3 dimensions of course being X, Y, and Z, 2 dimensions being X and Y. This 2.5 deals with being able to snap to a grid. You can have an active grid. So for example, whenever you create an object, and we're going to get into this more in depth when we get into the command panel, but you have an auto grid setting that you can turn on. So with that auto grid or that grid turned on, it allows you to select or snap to the 2D dimensions of that grid as well as the 3rd dimension where that grid plane lies in. Also, you can right click on any one of these snaps buttons and get their options. For example, if you wanted to change what the selection snaps to, you have all these selection presets here. And then you have options for the display marker, snap to frozen objects. You have a lot of options here. Also your home grid, which is the grid you see in 3D Studio Max, can be adjusted by this home grid tab. So for example, if you wanted each grid spacing to be 12 inches apart, you could set this to 12. And now each grid spacing is 1 foot from each other, or 1 foot square. And then however many grids until a major grid line, and then perspective grid extents, how far out this grid extends in your perspective viewport. The next button is an angle snap toggle. This toggles your rotation snaps. So if I only wanted to rotate in certain increments, say I wanted to make sure I rotated this exactly 45 degrees, without this angle snap toggle turned on, as you can see as I rotate, I'm really having to concentrate on getting 45 degrees. But with the toggle turned on, it rotates in 5-degree increments, or whatever you have it set up to rotate in. So now that is exactly 45 degrees. So it makes it a lot easier when you're trying to rotate objects precisely. This next one is percent snap toggle, which is scaling. If I were to try to scale an object, I wanted to scale this exactly 150% of itself. It works a lot like the angle snap toggle, where it only scales in certain increments. So now you can see, just by watching this little rollout, this spinner down here for my scale XYZ, right there's 150%. And then your spinner snap toggle deals with your parameters of your objects and these spinner buttons here. If you only wanted the spinner buttons to spin in certain increments, you have the option of adjusting that here. And the spinner button increments, if you turn it on and then right click on it, it will take you to the preference settings dialog box, and your spinner increments precision is set here in this spinner section of this tab, of your general tab. This next button is selection sets. If you open that up, pull it out to the side, this allows you to set up certain selection sets of objects So for example, if I knew that there was a certain selection that I would be using over and over, I could go in and select those objects, create new set with this first button, click on the little plus beside the new set, and it opens up a hierarchy of objects in that set. So torus 1 and sphere 1 are both in that selection set. You can delete or remove objects from selection sets, add objects, select objects in the set, select objects by name, and then highlight selected objects if they're not already highlighted. So again, this tool is for optimizing how objects are selected in 3D Studio Max, and it's real helpful with large scenes where you have a lot of objects in your scene. And that selection set can be chosen here from this drop down list. So for example, if I wanted to select those objects again without even touching them, go down here and select the selection set, and there they are. Alright, the next button is Mirror Align. We're going to cover these two transform tools in video 6, so come back for those. The next one is Manage Layers, which opens up your Layers dialog box. The layers in Max are very comparable to layers in AutoCAD, so even if you bring in an AutoCAD scene, it uses the layers in that scene and can actually list them here for you. So you can create layers, add objects to layers, select objects in your layers, etc. This next button is your Graphite Modeling Tools. Your Graphite Modeling Tools are more advanced modeling tools for modeling with sub-objects. So we're going to do a nice lesson on that in the more intermediate to advanced classes. So come back for those. Schematic, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Curve Editor open. This opens up your curve editor for how Max deals with animation curves. If I had some animation in here, you would see those animation curves with their perspective keyframes on this graph, and you can actually go in and do all your animating through the track view in Curve Editor. And when we get into animation, we're going to get into those a lot more in depth. Next is Schematic View. Schematic View shows you exactly all your objects in the scene and how they are related to each other, specifically with hierarchies and linking. So you can see my box and my sphere here in this view, and they have a linking line connecting them. That line goes from the box to the sphere, so that means this sphere is linked to the box, and the box is the parent of the sphere. So this is sort of a flow sheet on how all the objects are connected and linked together. If you have lots of links in the scene, then this will help you manage those links and actually allows you to link objects up in this Schematic View dialog box. Again, we're going to cover a lot of these tools in depth a little later on. So very good stuff in this dialog box. You'll want to come back and learn a lot about that. Schematic View, and then the next one is your Material Editor. We'll have a whole lesson on materials. We'll have an intro to materials, and we'll get into beginner, intermediate, and advanced materials. But for now, if you click on the Material Editor button, it'll open up the Material Editor, and this holds all your materials that can be applied to your objects in the scene. And this is a very large part of Max, so it takes a lot to cover. So we're going to come back and cover that later. The next three buttons deals with rendering in Max. So render setup, render frame window, and render production. So if you want to do a quick render, click on render production, and there's my scene rendered. The next few buttons are your XYZ restriction buttons for your coordinate system. Those buttons actually change depending on what axis you're moving your object in. So you can see, if you watch, if I move this object in the x-axis, my x restriction becomes active. If I move it in the z-axis, my z restriction becomes active, and so on and so forth. If I move it in the y and x, my x and y restriction becomes active. So this just kind of keeps up with all the axis restrictions. AutoGrid is a toggle button for allowing us to create objects from the surface of other objects. So with this AutoGrid turned on, every time I create an object, as long as I am over the surface of another object, it will assume that I'm wanting to create this new object from that surface. So as you can see, I'm getting my little coordinate center rolling around on top of this sphere, so by click and drag I can create a cylinder directly on the surface of another object. Pretty handy little tool. So as long as this AutoGrid is turned on, it allows you to do that. This next drop down list is Array, and has some special tools here. Array, snapshots, and so on. We're going to cover Array along with Mirror and Align when we get into the Transform Tools section. And this is your Layers dialog box. We already have covered a lot of this, but this is your toolbar for your layers. Let me drag this over here so you can see. So it gives you a quick way to see what's in your layers, what layers you have. Allows you to create new layers, add selections to your layers, select objects in this current layer, so on. So if you if you open this Manage Layers, it opens up that layer dialog box for you and lets you see all the options for your layers. And that about covers the menu bar. We got through a lot this time, but there's still a whole world of Macs that we've got to go through. So plenty of stuff in here, plenty of knowledge to pull from this site. So come on back and learn more about Macs.